The Holy Gospel according to St. Luke, the 13th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Now Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. And just then there appeared a woman with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. She was bent over and was quite unable to stand up straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." When he laid his hands on her, immediately she stood up straight and began praising God. But the leader of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, kept saying to the crowd, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be cured, and not on the Sabbath day." But the Lord answered him and said, "You hypocrites! Does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to give it water? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day?" When he said this, all his opponents were put to shame, and the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things that he was doing. This is the gospel of our Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
For the past 2 weeks, I've been experimenting with interactive sermons. God's word is a living word, one that comes to us through our lives, through other people, through our lived experiences, and through our stories. During the sermon last week, you wrote questions on a sheet of paper, passed them up front, and we discussed them together as a group. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to discuss every question, but the Holy Spirit was planning ahead. And we do get to discuss one of last week's questions today. The question was, if there is not bad, how can we identify good? If there is not bad, how can we identify good? Our perception of good and bad are heavily influenced by our own interests. What is good for me is not necessarily good for my neighbor. Likewise, what is good for my neighbor is not necessarily good for me. For example, Amanda and I, a couple weeks ago at our family reunion, were at one of my favorite restaurants. The restaurant is a pizza buffet called Pizza Ranch. We've gone there for dinner each year for at least the last 10 years at our family reunion. Now, we always call ahead so we don't alarm the kitchen staff when 15 of us walk through the door expecting to eat. Even though we called ahead this time, though, we caught them unprepared. We felt like a swarm of locusts descending on the buffet line. And after we moved through the line, the buffet was cleaned out completely. And they couldn't make pizza fast enough to replace what my cousins, my aunts, my uncles, and I were all eating. Now, this made the buffet line a very, very competitive place. They have a dessert pizza there called cactus bread. I love cactus bread. It's one of my favorite foods on the buffet line, and may well be the only reason that I go to Pizza Ranch. It was my turn, almost, to take cactus bread when the woman in front of me loaded up her plate with the rest of it and walked off. This was terrible. I was disappointed. From my perspective, this was a bad thing. I was looking forward to the cactus bread, and now it was gone. But from the perspective of the woman who stood in line ahead of me, well, this was a very good thing. She got the last of the cactus bread, and they weren't going to refill it anytime soon. This is a pretty tame example. talking about something with more dramatic social consequences, like property taxes versus school budgets, or business vitality versus layoffs, or immigration versus God-given human rights. Our perception of what is good and what is bad is heavily influenced by our own interests. Now, when Isaiah was prophesying to the people of Israel, this was about 600 BCE, the people of Israel were mistaking their own interests for God's interests. They became so preoccupied with pursuing their own good that justice was skewed by bribes. The hungry went without bread. The homeless went without shelter. The naked went without clothing. The needs of the afflicted went unsatisfied. And the teaching of God's law contributed to the oppression of the vulnerable. Israel's priorities were exposed in Isaiah's interpretation of the Sabbath law. Isaiah speaks for God, saying, "If you refrain from trampling the Sabbath, from pursuing your own interests on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the holy day of the Lord honorable, if you honor it, not going your own ways, serving your own interests, or pursuing your own affairs, then you shall take delight in the Lord." Now, here the Sabbath is not simply about resting from work. It's about binding the impulse to put our own interests ahead of God's interests. It's about limiting the harm that we do to others with our own agendas. It's about reprioritizing our affairs and placing the interests of our most vulnerable neighbors before our own. And all of this so that others may have life. Our perception of good and bad is heavily influenced by our own interests. We are naturally competitive, putting our own interests first, whether it's for cactus bread at a buffet line or something with greater social consequences. This caused a problem in ancient Israel. And also, when we pursue our own affairs and seek our own good, we, like the ancient Israelites, have a tendency to label our own interests as good and competing interests as bad. In ancient Israel, the interests of the powerful, of the rich, of those with food, perhaps even of the average Israelite, were not good for Israel's most vulnerable people. Humanity's inability to tell the difference between good and bad turned the Lord's law, meant for the life of the Israelites, meant so that God could live with them, into an instrument that perpetuated injustice and upheld oppression, the very antithesis of what the law was meant to do. During Isaiah's lifetime, an invading nation brought an end to Israel's way of life. The educated were executed or enslaved. Jerusalem was torched, and God's temple, a smoldering pile of ash on the ground. This tragic loss of life and home was received by faith as God's punishment for mistaking human interests for God's interests. So how can we identify good? How can we identify good? At this time, I'm going to ask you to find a partner or two and to take several minutes to discuss this question. And I'm going to invite you guys now, Paul and Betty, to come and join us as we do this. I'm going to keep an eye on the clock, and in a few minutes, I'm going to gather us all back together, and we're going to share what we talked about in each of our groups. So please get into groups of 2 or 3 now and discuss the question, how can we identify good? One of the challenges, I think, with what is good and what is bad is when we think we can identify for ourselves what the good is, what the bad is, it leads to something, leads to being judgmental of others. Valerie brought this up, and I asked her permission to share that judgmentalism causes one of the biggest issues when we're trying to love others. She named Jesus' command to love one another as you love yourself, and that judgmentalism works against that. To think that you know what someone else's good is, to think that you can determine for somebody what is good, what is bad, or name that for someone, often leads to judgmentalism, and it undermines the love that we want to share, the love we feel called to share, the love we claim that God has for others. And that is, we'll find out in our book read, is one of the main things that drives people away from churches. That perception that churches are judgmental places. Places that believe they can name for people what the good is and what the bad is. Now, as you heard today, it's very hard to try to identify for ourselves what is good and what is bad. There are lots of different measures, lots of different things we try, and I can't send you home today with the answer because I don't have it. But I can send you home with an answer. God alone knows what is good. Our inability to tell the difference between good and bad has led to the stoning of many prophets, the crucifixion of Jesus, the persecution of many faithful Christians, including Martin Luther. Discipleship is not about knowing the difference between good and bad. Discipleship is about trusting God alone, who knows what is good, to continually correct us and to continually guide us in all things. And when we stop seeing the world in terms of good and bad, we are open to seeing Christ in the midst of the world. We are open to seeing those who are violated when we place our own interests before the interests of our neighbor. We are open to the redeeming power of Jesus' cross, both for ourselves and for other people. We are open to the voice of the Holy Spirit coming through our neighbors. The following words from Isaiah are God's promise for you today. The Lord will guide you continually and satisfy your needs in parched places, and make your bones strong. And you shall be like a watered garden, like a spring of water, whose waters never fail.